Business news from the Capital Region. This is Washington Business Report with ABC7 national correspondent Rebecca Cooper.
Thanks for joining us for this week's look at business and finance in the Washington region. Coming up on today's show, an investigative reporter tells us how businesses may be implicated in a jaw-dropping corruption case of a former Pennsylvania mayor. Plus, our small business spotlight focuses on turning media attention into money. And in our roundtable this week, wages and housing prices are up, but Donald Trump is out, at least according to one major media site, with some new warnings from one of Washington's top business leaders. But first, one big story making headlines this week focuses on the corruption of a public official. But the story behind Harrisburg Mayor Stephen Reed and how he drove Pennsylvania's capital city into bankruptcy also raises troubling questions about the role the business community played in this saga. This week, prosecutors announced Reed is facing 499 criminal charges, including theft, bribery, fraud, and the use of public monies for personal gain. Pennsylvania's Attorney General called it one of the most disturbing cases of public corruption her office had ever seen. But who else shares in the blame beyond former Mayor Reed for the capital city's economic ruin? Our own ABC7 I-Team reporter Chris Papst has written a book about the bankruptcy called Capital Murder. And based on his years of covering the story, he says business leaders often look the other way or participated in the plundering of this American city. Chris, it's a great read, Capital Murder, but it's a real tragedy, and everyone suffers the consequences, most of all the taxpayers. What happened? The mayor was using bonds for schools, for retrofitting an incinerator, and doing what with all this money?
Well, largely whatever he wanted. So he was taking out these massive amounts of loans, and he was just siphoning parts of it off, $500,000 here, $500,000 there, $25 million here, $7 million there. And he was taking it and putting it into another pot and then distributing that money. And largely what he was doing with that money was he was investing in other aspects of the city. He was investing in construction, he was investing in high rises, he was investing in people in the business community and also people just around that area that he thought could make the city look better. So you take out, let's say, a $125 million loan on an incinerator, a trash to steam incinerator. Okay, well, it's not going to make the city look that much prettier, but if you siphon off a part of that, you give it to a couple construction workers, you have them build a high-rise or a mid-rise, and now you have something more tangible people can look at and say our mayor's great.
Okay, so some people will look at it and say, hey, wrong way to do it, but maybe still in the best interest of the city. But wrong, according to your book, for a few different reasons. One is many of the projects that he was siphoning money off to weren't well considered. You give the example of one, Strawberry Square Development, a local contractor, Harrisburg Development, wanted money to invest in that retail space. He ended up guaranteeing up to $95 billion in principal plus interest for that development, even as they were losing retailers. Yeah,
that was one of the things that he was doing. So he was getting this money to the developers, and then when the developer was a little bit iffy still, he would then guarantee the debt on that money, and he would use the city taxpayer as collateral, if you will. And this is what the Attorney General in Pennsylvania said is completely wrong. And not only that, what makes this even more significant is that people may look at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and they're going to say, okay, it's a city of 50,000. Yeah, it's the capital of a big state. It's not Detroit. It becomes the first capital city in American history to go bankrupt. Okay, 50,000 people. But the significance here is the Attorney General said that when that first round of charges came down, the 499 charges you mentioned, there's another round to come. And that's going to be the consultants. That's going to be the contractors. That could be the bond attorneys.
The members of the business community who were benefiting from all of this, not only looking the other way, but in many cases participating. And I want to get to one crazy part of the story, because you say this is a mayor who lived not just in a typical row house, but in kind of a rundown row house. This is not a guy who was lining his own pockets, as far as we can tell, but he was spending bizarre amounts of money on artifacts and memorabilia for all these different museums he said he wanted to create on the Wild West. And he had things like a vampire kit in his own home. Was he mentally unstable?
That was his hobby. And he did create 2 museums in Harrisburg. He created the National Civil War Museum, and he also created the Firemen's Museum, the Pennsylvania National Firemen's Museum. His idea was to create many more and to make Harrisburg a destination city.
But as the Washington Post pointed out this week, for things like a Wild West Museum, when they're not even considered part of the Wild West.
But his argument was they once were. So 250 years ago, central Pennsylvania was the West. And the river that cuts through it, the Susquehanna River, you had to cross that to get west. So his argument was this was the West at one point.
Clearly he was going unchecked. Clearly people within the city government were culpable, as you outline in your book. Clearly people in the business community were culpable. What's the lesson for the rest of America and the rest of the business community about looking the other way or even participating when there's easy money to be had?
Well, the lesson here is that people in a city significantly suffer when their government fails them. And it's rarely ever one person that's the result of that. Now, in Harrisburg, you had a mayor for 28 years who
he was called the mayor for life, like
yes.
our once mayor for life, Marion Barry.
And he was, Stephen Reed was a dictator to the fullest extent. Nothing in that city got done unless it went through him. City council, the treasurer, no one got elected, businesses could not come in without him. He was the ringleader. But the people that were working with him, they were also involved in it. They were taking tens of millions of dollars for projects that they knew the money was not borrowed for that project. So if these indictments do come down, it could set a different precedent in America where if cities go bankrupt, and the people of that city suffer, the contractors and the business community that were involved in it, they can also be held accountable.
I think not just that, but I think the other lesson from your book is not just the business leaders who are directly involved, but those who looked the other way, they all paid the ultimate price because they ended up with a bankrupt city. And so everyone was in the end hurt by the largesse that they thought they were benefiting from.
Oh, they were benefiting from it. I mean, we mentioned in this book of it's a $16 million payout in fees for just a couple of these bond transactions.
But once you've got a business in a bankrupt city, it's not going to be very successful. So
absolutely.
If you see something, say something,
yes.
even if you're a business leader. Chris Papst, it's a great book with a lot of lessons for everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Washington Business Report.